Hey, I want to talk about two subjects here, which is dictatorship and Pan-Africanism. I would ask you to watch the whole video before commenting, just so you do understand the whole context of where I'm coming from, and I'll try not to speak it for too long. Obviously, these are controversial subjects, at least in the way I'm talking about them. It's controversial, but I believe someone needs to say this because it's something that I've noticed consistently. Originally, I was going to make a subject about dictatorship and apologists for dictatorship in general, but I think I'll tie that into this. Um, so the background to this is that I was watching a video which was basically about a typical day, or no, not a typical day, a critical day in the life of three well-known dictators, Joseph Stalin, Idi Amin, and Muammar Gaddafi. Now, the Stalin part wasn't so contentious. Everyone agrees he was a brutal dictator. But with Gaddafi especially, and uh, there was a lot of apologists on the thread, and they were coming out like things predictably like, oh, how about Bush, how about Obama, how about Tony Blair, etc. So in other words, it's this mentality of a perception of double standards, or a perception that there's a bias against dictators from developing countries, so to speak. Now there may well be a bias. I'll be objective enough to say that that might be the case, but we have to remember the context of the word dictator. It begins in ancient Rome. Dictator was a title that Roman emperors actually conferred on themselves to denote absolute power over the Senate. And ever since then, we've associated it with some very unpleasant figures in history. The documentary itself was quite interesting, although there's a few flaws with it. For example, at the start, they said the three worst dictators of the 20th century. Well, that would clearly be Stalin. Okay, he's included, but also Hitler and Mao. Hitler and Mao, for some reason, weren't there. I think it would have been more interesting if it had been Hitler, Stalin, and Mao, rather than Hitler, Amin, and Gaddafi. Although Amin and Gaddafi both had some serious human rights abuses under their terms. Terms, actually, I shouldn't say that. I backtrack immediately. Terms is the wrong word, because the whole point about dictatorship is dictators are for life. They don't care about term limits. And this is why it is important to differentiate between um, people like this and American presidents. Now, the point I would make is you can criticize someone, you can talk about immoral policies, you could say they have blood on their hands, etc., etc. And I think it's perfectly legitimate to have a debate about that. But calling American presidents and British prime ministers dictators simply goes against the definition of what a dictator is. The fact of the matter is, American presidents and British prime ministers have to get elected. Now, I'm aware that with Bush Gore there was controversy over the outcome of that, and I still think there's a lot of questions to be answered. With the exception of Bush, therefore, American presidents are democratically elected. Incidentally, I should say that Bush versus Gore ended up in the Supreme Court ruling in which Bush was found to be legally right to be president. It still remains controversial. But the general point I'm making is that you cannot, as a general rule, say that Western, or I should say British and American leaders are dictators. It goes against the definition of what a dictator is. You could say that they're guilty of immoral policies. You could say they've blood on their hands. Fine. But to say that they're dictators is it just going against the definition of the word. And definitions are important. Now, on this thread, there was those sort of people, but I noticed quite a lot of them, especially in the case of those defending Idi Amin, were what I would describe as Pan-Africanists. Now, in regards to Pan-Africanism as an ideology, I fully understand how it came about, just as I understand how the Black Power movement came about. It came about in the post-colonial era, in the decolonization era, I should say, of about the 1950s to the 1970s. And on the surface, its principle was an understandable one: African nations working together to fight colonialism. Coming from a country that had the world's largest empire, I fully recognize that colonialism is a deeply controversial subject and has caused enormous bloodshed and pain to humanity. I fully recognise that. Although I also contend that not everything about the British Empire is bad. And I don't care if that's controversial. I believe that something so big and that lasted for such a long time, you can't simply dismiss it as all evil. The background was selfish, the background was exploitative, but I do not accept that it was entirely bad and everything about it was entirely bad. Among other things, there was Westminster system of government was promoted around the world, and I would argue overall that was a good thing, overall, among other things. But I've noticed that among those who defend African dictators most forcefully are Pan-Africanists, and I want to challenge what I regard as double standards on their part. Now, the whole sort of underlying theme of the Pan-Africanist argument is that they see themselves as a victim against greedy European colonialists. Now, like I say, there is historical context to that, and it could be argued that multinational companies are still exploiting Africa today. So I fully understand the debates around that, but I still have a problem with the double standards of attacking European power whilst completely ignoring subjugation within the African context. I'll give you some examples. Idi Amin is a prime example. There's no escaping the fact the man was an absolute tyrant. Now, how anybody could try and argue otherwise, I don't understand. There was one point in the mid-70s where so many people were being killed in Uganda under his regime that the hydroelectric dam near Kampala, forget the name of the dam, but the hydroelectric dam near Kampala was being blocked, and ordinary Ugandans had power cuts, and they knew the reason was because bodies were being dumped in the river. Meanwhile, Idi Amin was actually far from being anti-Western. He was playing the host to Western diplomats and Western businessmen. So Idi Amin was entirely a selfish figure. He couldn't care less about the average Ugandan. The same applies to Robert Mugabe. So I find it strange that these guys are held up as great African heroes when the fact of the matter is, in both cases, they couldn't give a shit about the average Ugandan or the average Zimbabwean. And this comes down to the Pan-Africanist notion that which constantly trumps them up as great revolutionary leaders. I do have a problem with that. It's the same with Gaddafi. Um, Now, in the case of Gaddafi, not we can't say that every dictatorship is the same. In the case of Gaddafi, there was more examples of progress within his country. Under Gaddafi, Libya probably did grow its GDP, and Gaddafi unquestionably had some positive policies. But part of the reason dictatorships endure is because they have to give the people something to sort of give themselves credibility and to stay in power. And that's all it is about power, power, power. When Gaddafi was lynched in 2011, there were ugly scenes, but what people need to understand is that came from years of repression. This wasn't barbarism on the part of the Libyan rebels who done this. Well, it was barbaric, but you have to understand there's a context to that. Um, in 1984, a young man was put on shoe trial, and the documentary shows this. You could argue that all of Gaddafi's victims were Islamists. Now, I've made it clear in my videos that I'm a staunch critic of Islamism. I think it's poisonous, and I think the government should tackle it. But I would also argue that tyrannic governments also fuel Islamism, and I don't think any rational person can deny this. So this show trial of the young man in 1984, given a kangaroo trial, and he was basically hung there and then on the spot. The allegation against him was that he'd received funding from the United States. But this is the sort of thing that the Gaddafi's regime done. In 1996, which is the day that they focus on in the documentary, he ordered his troops to gun down 1,200 inmates of the Abu Salim prison. Many of those protesting in 2011 were the wives and daughters of those inmates who were killed. Now, they may well have been Islamists, but all that action done was fueled jihad against the Gaddafi regime. Um, but it wasn't just Islamists he persecuted. I mean, his famous entourage of young female guards, sort of, we see it as one of the sort of eccentric displays of a mad dictator. But when you look at it, these young women had no choice. They were essentially sex slaves. So, When people go out of their way to make excuses for Muammar Gaddafi, they forget all of these things and they just overlook all of these things. Let's not forget too that he has been directly linked to the Lockerbie atrocity. You know, that wasn't an attack on soldiers. It wasn't an attack on the British government or the American government. They were just ordinary civilians blown up out of the sky. Now, yes, you could say that America was guilty of state terrorism when they bombed Tripoli. But, you know, what I'm getting at here is the whole argument about the Pan-Africanists come out with is that they can criticize the policies of European leaders, but completely overlook the crimes committed by African leaders. And I think there's double standards in that. Look at Mugabe's regime. So we have heard about the persecution of white farmers, but black Zimbabweans have suffered as well. Um, and I get really sick of people making excuses for these guys. They're not heroes, they're tyrants. And frankly, when you get Pan Africanist publications like New African, which incidentally is published in London, um, and basically they're constantly, I've bought that a few times, and the entire rhetoric, the entire discourse of that magazine is entirely about victimhood. It's about Africans being exploited by the evil Europeans and about European double standards this, European double standards that, the terrible races of British Empire, etc. And it's predictable. But they never criticize African leaders. I've bought that publication a few times. I'm yet to see them make an editorial criticizing, for example, the excesses of the Mugabe regime. Why not? Why not? So I think there is double standards in this regard. Pan-Africanists say that they're standing up for the interests and needs of Africans. If that is the case, then why are they turning a blind eye to some serious human rights abuses being committed by African dictators? You can't have it both ways. You can't say that you're victims on one hand and then turn a blind eye to atrocities being committed by African leaders. And by the way, this is not about demonizing Africa or Africans. Why? Because unlike Pan Africanists, I don't think that all Africans are the same. Africa's a continent, it's not a country. It's a continent of over 1 billion people. And I'm sure there's many Africans from various countries who would agree with everything I'm saying. But I feel that their voice is drowned out by this neo-nationalist, Pan-Africanist mentality. Like I say, I do understand how it began. I fully understand that. But I think it is guilty of hypocrisy in this regard. And I'm well aware people are going to be saying, oh, you're from a wealthy country, you're speaking from a vantage point of privilege. But the point I'm talking about is it's not about me, it's about my concern for those Africans, and it is overwhelmingly Africans who suffer from these maniacs. Idi Amin was a thug. Let's stop glossing it over. The man was a thug. Um, Robert Mugabe is a thug. I mean, think about it. Zimbabwe is one of the world's poorest countries. He had a lavish birthday party for his 90th birthday. He spent millions on that. Now, when the BBC reported that, all I heard from privileged Africans, incidentally, was about, oh, it's biased Western media again. And in a lot of the situations where there's dictatorships, very often it is actually the more privileged classes who defend the dictators, because those who don't have a voice can't. Um, I mean, in a country like Zimbabwe, not everyone is going to have access to a computer, but those who do, in other words, the more privileged people, are the very ones who want to defend Mugabe, probably because they're the people who are like more likely to have privilege from his regime. You know, never mind the people who have had their farms burned down. So I get really fed up with his victimhood mentality and the double standards within it. I wouldn't have a problem, and I really want to emphasize this point because I think it's important. I don't have a problem with Western leaders being criticized. And I'm not going to sit here and say that the relationship between developed countries in Africa is an ideal one. I'm not going to deny that there is exploitation. I'm not going to deny that a sort of post-colonial problem exists in terms of exploitation, in terms of the behavior of multinationals. But I'm sick of the narrative from the Pan-Africanists that says it is entirely about the evil, terrible European and North American or well developed countries. If you can blame colonialism for all the problems, how do you explain the fact that there are Asian countries such as Vietnam, China, and India, which also had experience of colonialism, and yet now have some of the fastest growing GDPs in the world. Okay, India still has a lot of poverty, but the point I'm making is blaming colonialism for everything, to me, is trying to hide away from responsibility. And I know that's a controversial thing to say, but I'm fed up of certain African leaders and certain African governments using blaming outsiders as an excuse for everything. With independence comes responsibility. Okay, so in many cases, these countries have been independent now for over 50 years. How long is colonialism going to be an excuse? Robert Mugabe and Idi Amin are entirely responsible for the brutality that occurred under their regimes. And just for once, I would like to see a Pan-Africanist acknowledge that. So, people are going to come on and say, I'm an apologist for colonialism. I started this video by saying I fully recognize the wrongs of colonialism. Okay? If I was an apologist for colonialism, I would just be going out of my way to say that, oh, it was all wonderful and Africans should stop complaining and everything was good. And I would be pretending that nothing bad ever happened. Well, that would be plain wrong. There was terrible things happened. There was racism. And one of the worst examples of tyranny in human history was when King Leopold II was Emperor of the Belgian Congo. We saw millions of Congolese perish. Terrible exploitation. So I am not glossing over the wrongs of colonialism. That's not what I'm doing. What I'm saying is that there is hypocrisy within the Pan-Africanist movement, and I'm getting fed up with it. Because you do see this a lot. Whenever there is a BBC or CNN or any report that happens to be from a Western source about African dictators, then it's the same old excuse. Oh, it's Western propaganda. And okay, you do see this when it's Asian dictators as well. Well, one point though about the West, that's a misleading term because if we're talking about the Western Hemisphere, there's been dictators in countries like Guatemala, um, and other parts of the world. So, in other parts of the world that are in the Western Hemisphere. I'm not saying that Western governments can't be criticised. I'm not saying that for a second. Um, but I do think if you're a Pan-Africanist, if you're going to talk about persecution, then you should be consistent in your argument. If you're going to talk about Europeans exploiting Africa, where's your condemnation of African leaders who don't give a damn about their own people? Where's your condemnation of that? I mean, in many cases, the disparity between wealth and poverty is much, much greater than it is in developed countries. I mean, for someone like Mugabe, okay, I know he played a role in the post-colonial era, but since 1980, gradually, he has been acting more and more like a totalitarian. Well, he is a totalitarian dictator. There's many other examples. Isaiah Afwerki in Eritrea, he's not a household name, but he's one of the world's worst dictators. Idris Deby in Chad. Um, there's other examples. So the idea that this is all one big Western conspiracy to give Africa a bad image, I'm sorry, but I don't buy that for a second. I regard it as what it is. These are men who are greedy, they're power crazy, and they don't give a damn about their own people. In the case of the Gaddafi regime, you can point out the positive things he's done for the Libyan people, but it still doesn't excuse some of the methods his regime used. Torture is torture is torture. And I don't even support torture against Islamists as much as I hate that ideology, because all it does is breeds more Islamism. That's what we're seeing with the Assad regime. Maybe if Assad Sr. hadn't been so brutal in his 1982 crackdown, we wouldn't be seeing the mess that we're seeing now. So it isn't just Africa, this can also apply to other parts of the world where totalitarianism exists. And I just think it's very sad that wherever you have these regimes, there are too many people willing to make excuses for it. Um, as a Westerner, I have a responsibility to condemn immoral foreign policy. But I think Pan-Africanists need to take more responsibility and be more honest as well, because I'm really sick and tired of them constantly using the same rhetoric about racism. Now, in regards to the racism issue, when human rights groups focus on African dictatorships, to argue that that is somehow racist to me is baffling, because the very people that they're defending are other Africans. It's not like they're saying we are superior white guys. Incidentally, a lot of human rights activists are locals. They're from African countries. So to try and make this an argument about racism to me is a perverse lie. It's an outright lie from the Pan-Africanist movement. Um, I did contact New African once and challenge them on some of this idea, and the editor, all she done was replied and said, "Oh well, basically she wasn't going to take any responsibility. She just replied and said, it's all down to perspective." So she was basically avoiding all the points I was making about double standards. Um, so to summarize, I don't have a problem with people criticizing colonialism. I don't have a problem with people criticizing um, even perceived double standards. There can be a debate about that. But I do have a problem with inconsistency in your approach. If you're going to talk about persecution, then be consistent. Incidentally, I find it very ironic that some of the people who are most vocal about condemning the colonial terrible West have no problem persecuting gay people, have no problem saying that we should lynch the gay men. It's complete double standards. You can't play the victim on one hand, then act as a persecutor on the other. You can't have it both ways. And the reason I'm saying all of this is because I do believe that one of Africa's main problems is a reluctance to take responsibility amongst too many governments. I'm not going to make a generalization and say this is universally the case. Africa does have some very good leaders, and there are people who recognize the problems, who are trying their damn best to do a very difficult job. There's many African leaders I have a lot of respect for. Mandela is one of the best examples. Although I don't absolutely, I do think he was a great leader, and one of the best things he done was avoided civil war in South Africa. He's rightly seen as a great leader. But that's just why Mandela is different from other Pan-Africanists. In this regard, I shouldn't say that I'm talking about all Pan-Africanists. But where Mandela was different was he specifically went out of his way not to demonize the entire white population. When he was freed from prison, he could have went down the path of Robert Mugabe, but he didn't. And for that, Mandela deserves enduring respect. What did Mugabe done when he fought for independence from Zimbabwe? He went down the path of demonizing the entire white population. Um, and basically, he once boasted that he was stronger than Adolf Hitler. Or yeah, I think the words were that he was the Adolf Hitler of Africa. I don't know how anyone can make excuses for guys like this. So, fine, criticize Western governments, say we're hypocrites, all the rest of it, but at very least, recognize what these guys are doing. Recognize that Idi Amin, Emperor Picasso, Robert Mugabe, there's many other examples, recognize and acknowledge and admit that they and they alone are to blame for the excesses of their regimes.